The boardroom smelled like money and certainty. Polished walnut table, floor-to-ceiling glass. The city spread below like something already owned. Aishan Hale sat at the head of the table because tradition demanded it, not because anyone expected him to lead. They spoke around him. As an Omega heir, your value is leverage, one advisor said smoothly, tapping a tablet. Visibility brings protection, another added. This is how legacies survive, a third concluded, smiling as if survival were generous. 3 alpha houses, 3 futures, all immaculate. They laid it out like a menu: strategic marriages, political access, regulatory immunity, a board-approved life with no sharp edges. Each proposal came with a projected timeline and a press strategy. They spoke as if love were a rounding error that could be smoothed away. Ision listened. He had learned to listen early. Being born an Omega heir meant being watched before being known. From childhood, he had been presented as an outcome, not a person. Photos staged for donors, smiles coached for cameras, compliments that carried instructions inside them. So composed, so suitable, so safe. Safe meant compliant. The advisors kept talking. Numbers floated, graphs rose and fell. Someone mentioned risk mitigation in a tone usually reserved for weather. Outside the glass wall, far below the tower, the service bay hummed. Rook Alvarez stood beneath a lifted sedan, grease on his forearms, jaw set in concentration. He worked by feel and sound, listening for the whisper of an engine settling into place. No one there knew his name, carried no weight. No one cared. The elevator from the service floors never came up to the boardroom. Ision glanced at the window and felt the familiar pressure settle between his shoulders, the sensation of a future tightening around him. "We're not asking," the lead advisor said kindly. "We're aligning." Aligning meant deciding for him. Ision folded his hands, immaculate cuffs brushing the table. "And if I decline?" A pause. A practiced one. The lead advisor smiled again. "No one has." They moved on as if the question were rhetorical. Ision's mind drifted, not to the proposals, but to a night when his vintage car had died on a side street he couldn't afford to be recognized on. Rain slicked the pavement. His phone battery hovered at 2%. He'd stood there, expensive coat already damp, rehearsing explanations he hated. Rook had rolled up the bay door without asking who he was. "Pop the hood," Rook had said, wiping his hands on a rag. No awe, no flattery, no calculation, just work. Rook fixed the car in 20 minutes and charged him for parts only. When Ision offered more, Rook shrugged. Didn't take longer? That honesty had lodged somewhere deep. Back in the boardroom, someone mentioned optics. Another said control. A third said ownership and didn't correct himself. Ision felt his throat tighten. "Your role," an advisor said, "is to be protected." Protected meant contained. "By whom?" Ision asked quietly. The room stilled. Just a fraction. The advisor recovered quickly. "By the right people." The right people didn't smell like oil and patience. They smelled like certainty. Ision looked down at the documents. His name sat at the top of every page like a seal. His future was already typeset. He imagined Rook's shop audited without cause. A zoning complaint appearing overnight. A fire inspection that found problems where there were none. Pressure that never left fingerprints. He imagined being told it was unfortunate, necessary, not personal. Ision lifted his gaze. "You speak as if my choice is irrelevant." The lead advisor leaned back, steepling fingers. "Your choice has always mattered, Ision. It just aligns best with reality." Reality, as they defined it, had no room for the man who fixed engines without asking questions. "I need time," Ision said. A beat. Another smile. "Of course," the advisor said, "but understand, markets dislike hesitation." Ision stood. The chair slid back softly. He thanked them. He smiled the way he had been taught. He walked out before the conversation could tighten further. In the elevator, the glass walls reflected a man everyone thought they understood. Below, the service bay lights flickered as Rook lowered the lift and reached for a wrench. Ision pressed the button to go down. Not because he had decided, because for the first time he needed air. The offer no one refused waited upstairs, patient and polished. And somewhere between floors, Izion felt the first real fracture in a future that had been decided without him. Would you trade love for power if the world told you it was for your own good? Is hesitation weakness, or the first sign of freedom? Ision Hale learned early how to disappear in plain sight. His childhood had been immaculate, white-gloved, well-lit, perfectly supervised. Private schools where teachers lowered their voices when speaking to him. Classmates who treated him carefully, as if proximity to his last name might leave fingerprints. Every achievement celebrated publicly, every mistake handled quietly. He was never alone, and he was never known. Being an Omega heir meant being presented. At galas, he stood half a step behind board members who introduced him as the future, the promise, the assurance. People spoke about him in the third person while he smiled directly at them. Compliments came packaged with expectations. So composed for an Omega, so mature, so safe a choice. Safety was the highest praise. At home, the silence was expensive. Art on the walls chosen by consultants, furniture arranged for optics, not comfort, conversations measured, meals scheduled. Even his sense suppressants were chosen for neutrality, nothing that might provoke instinct or attention. He learned to watch instead. He watched how power moved through rooms without raising its voice. He watched how deals were made long before signatures appeared. He watched how Omegas like him were discussed as assets, not people. Protected, yes, but also contained. He told himself this was normal. Then, one night, his car broke down. It happened on a street that didn't care who he was. The engine stuttered once and died, leaving him standing beneath a flickering streetlight with rain seeping into his coat and his phone dying in his palm. He considered calling security, then stopped. He didn't want to explain where he was. He didn't want to be told what to do. The mechanic shop was still open, lights harsh and honest, bay doors rolled up to the night. Isyon hesitated before stepping inside, already rehearsing how to make himself smaller. Rook Alvarez looked up from an engine block and frowned, not in recognition but in irritation at the interruption. "You stuck?" Rook asked. "Yes," Isyon said. Rook wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward the street. "Pop the hood." No questions, no assessment, no shift in tone. Aishin watched him work, really watched. The confidence wasn't loud, it didn't perform. Rook listened to the engine like it was speaking a language he respected. His hands were scarred, movements precise, patience baked into every adjustment. "You take good care of it," Rook said eventually. "Someone tried to tune it like it was newer than it is." Isyon smiled before he could stop himself. "I appreciate things that last." Rook snorted softly. "Then you picked the wrong mechanic before." 20 minutes later, the engine purred. Rook named a price that barely covered parts. When Isyon offered more, Rook shook his head. "Didn't take longer." That was it. No interest in his name, no curiosity about where he came from, no calculation. Honesty, unadorned, it lodged in Isyon's chest like something dangerous. He started finding reasons to return, small ones at first, a noise, a checkup, an excuse to step into a space where no one measured his worth in leverage. Rook never asked, never pried. They talked about engines, about weather, about nothing that required performance. Rook treated him like a man who existed, not an outcome, not an asset. When Iseon eventually told him the truth, quietly, one evening after closing, Rook didn't react the way people always did. No awe, no fear, just a long look and a nod. "Okay," Rook said. "Does that change what you need fixed?" It didn't. That was when Iseon realized how little of his life had ever felt that simple. Up in the glass tower, futures were being negotiated with his name attached. Down in the shop, a man fixed what was broken and let the rest be. Iseon began to understand the difference between being protected and being known. The offers didn't stop. They multiplied. What began as polite invitations hardened into expectations, dinners with carefully curated guest lists, calls framed as check-ins that slid seamlessly into negotiations. Advisors spoke in softer voices now, as if sweetness made coercion easier to swallow. 3 alpha houses, 3 variations of the same promise: protection, access, control. Each proposal arrived with reassurances tailored to soothe an Omega heir's supposed anxieties. No threats, no ultimatums, just futures wrapped in velvet language, and always, just beneath the surface, the same implication. This is what safety looks like. Ision listened, nodded, delayed. Markets, they said, valued certainty. Investors disliked ambiguity. The public needed a narrative. Love was never mentioned, except as a distraction. That word appeared for the first time in a private memo forwarded to him by mistake. Ision read it twice. The second time, his hands shook. Rook's shop was audited the following week. The inspector was polite, almost apologetic, cited outdated paperwork, minor compliance issues, nothing that couldn't be resolved, eventually. The timing was unfortunate, he said. Ision knew better. Permits stalled. A zoning complaint surfaced that referenced a regulation no one enforced anymore. A delivery truck was rerouted without explanation. Customers began canceling appointments, muttering about rumors they couldn't quite name. Nothing overt, nothing illegal, just pressure. Ision felt it coil around his spine, familiar and cold. This was how systems corrected anomalies, not with force, but with attrition. Rook didn't complain. He worked longer hours, fixed what he could, paid fines without asking where the scrutiny came from. When Aishin tried to explain, Rook held up a hand. "Hey," he said gently, "you don't owe me answers you didn't choose to give." That made it worse. The message arrived 2 nights later. No sender, no signature, just a single line, delivered through a channel meant for corporate updates: choose stability or watch him disappear. Ision stared at the screen until the words blurred. He'd always known visibility had a cost. He hadn't realized how quickly the bill could be redirected to someone else. That night, he stood outside the shop after closing, watching Rook clean up, wrench by wrench, surface by surface. Ordinary work, honest work, a life that had never asked to be folded into power games. "This was my fault," Iseon said quietly. Rook looked up. "No, I brought this to your door." Rook leaned against the workbench, studying him. "You didn't light the fire." "They will," Iseon said, "if I don't choose." Rook didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. "Then the question isn't what they want." He stepped closer. "It's what you do." Iseon felt the fear finally take root. Not for himself, but for the man in front of him. For the way love, once discovered, could be used as leverage. For the first time, Iseon understood what it meant to be dangerous just by caring. If power demands sacrifice, who should pay the price? And if love becomes a liability, do you abandon it or expose the system that made it one? Iseon tried to do the responsible thing. That was how he framed it to himself. Responsibility, not fear. Protection, not retreat. He told himself that stepping back was an act of care. That distance could function as a shield if he applied it correctly. He started with omissions. He delayed visits, answered messages hours later, kept conversations lighter, safer, trimmed of anything that sounded like commitment. When Rook asked if something was wrong, Iseon smiled and said the board was relentless, which was true, but incomplete. Rook noticed anyway. They were standing near the open bay doors one evening, the shop washed in orange streetlight, when Iseon finally forced the words out. "This isn't sustainable," Iseon said. "Us." Rook didn't react the way Iseon had rehearsed. No anger, no disbelief, just attention. "Why?" Rook asked. Iseon gestured vaguely toward the city, toward the invisible hands tightening around everything. "We live in different worlds. The timing is wrong. The risk—" "Is this what you want?" Rook interrupted quietly. "Or what they want for you?" The question landed clean and devastating. Iseon opened his mouth and realized he didn't have an answer that didn't sound like surrender. Rook watched him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Okay," he said. "If you decide that's your choice, I'll respect it." There was no accusation in his voice. That hurt more than one would have. They didn't touch that night. They didn't argue. Iseon left with the sick certainty that he had just done violence to something honest in the name of safety. The board meeting was scheduled 2 days later. The invitation was marked mandatory. Public announcement pending, the agenda read. Engagement alignment. Iseon read it in the back of a car with tinted windows and felt his hands start to shake. That night, the shop caught fire. It wasn't dramatic. No explosions, no sirens screaming through the street, just smoke and heat and a back wall blackened badly enough to make the message unmistakable. Ruled an accident before the ash cooled. Faulty wiring, they said. Old building. Unfortunate. Rook stood amid the damage the next morning, soot on his jaw, eyes hollowed by lack of sleep, rebuilding a hydraulic lift by hand because the replacement would take weeks. Ision arrived breathless, coat discarded, control gone. I tried to push you away, Ision said, voice breaking, and they still. Rook set the wrench down carefully. Listen to me, Rook said. If you think leaving me fixes this, you don't understand how they work. Ision swallowed. Then what do I do? Rook stepped closer, close enough that the smell of smoke and oil clung to both of them. You stop letting them decide. The boardroom was waiting. The advisors had already taken their seats when Ision walked in the next morning. Faces composed, smiles practiced, the future arranged neatly on tablets and slides. They expected compliance. Ision took his seat. Then he stood. And for the first time in his life, he didn't ask for permission to speak. I'm declining all offers, Ision said. The words didn't echo. The room absorbed them the way wealth absorbed shock, slowly, incredulously, then with irritation. The lead advisor smiled, assuming theater. Ision, let's be practical. No, Ision said calmly, effective immediately. A few board members exchanged glances. Someone chuckled under their breath. They were used to Omega's posturing, to moments of resistance that folded under reassurance. Ision didn't sit back down. He continued, voice steady, unraised. I'm also releasing documentation I've compiled over the last 9 months. Tablets chimed almost in unison. Files opened. Graphs dissolved into correspondence. Legal language gave way to internal memos. Pressure campaigns labeled risk alignment, shell entities coordinating zoning delays, audits scheduled to coincide with non-compliance suggestions. Names appeared, dates, approval chains. Someone swore quietly. This is highly inappropriate, a director snapped. It's accurate, Ision replied. And it's mine. The laughter stopped. I am stepping down as a figurehead, Ision said, and assuming operational control as outlined in Clause 14C. Silence. Then louder disbelief. That clause requires a majority stake, Ision finished, which I hold. He signed. The stylus clicked against glass like a verdict. Markets reacted within minutes. Not collapse, hesitation. Partners paused. Analysts recalibrated. The empire didn't fall apart. It shifted, startled to discover it could. The board tried to recover. Threats were implied, consequences hinted at. Ision listened, nodded, and ended the meeting without ceremony. Outside, the city felt different. Not kinder, not safer, just honest. He went straight to the shop. The air still smelled like smoke and oil. Rook was under a lift, sleeves rolled, rebuilding what could be salvaged. He slid out when Ision's shoes scuffed the concrete. I choose you, Ision said, but I won't make you pay for it. Rook studied him for a long moment, then set the wrench down. Then don't, Rook said. Stand with me. Ision did. The fallout was not immediate. That was the part Ision hadn't expected. He had grown up believing that defiance triggered punishment instantly, that systems retaliated loudly, visibly, so the lesson could be learned by anyone watching. But the world he had just challenged was older and more sophisticated than that. It didn't rage, it recalibrated. The first sign was silence. No congratulatory calls, no furious confrontations, no dramatic headlines declaring the fall of the Heir Empire. Markets dipped and then steadied. Analysts spoke in careful language about unexpected consolidation and a period of internal restructuring. From the outside, it looked almost elegant. Inside the elite circles that had raised him, doors closed with soft finality. Invitations stopped arriving. Long-standing social commitments dissolved into polite excuses. Advisors who had once spoken to him daily now filtered communication through legal teams. The tone shifted from paternal confidence to distant concern. You've made a mistake, the silence said. We'll let you feel it. Ision felt it most acutely in the absence of protection he'd never noticed before, the kind that smoothed over inconveniences, that redirected scrutiny, that ensured the world bent just enough to stay comfortable. Without it, things took effort. Real effort. He rode public transit for the first time in years and stood pressed between strangers who didn't know his name and didn't care. He waited in line. He filled out forms himself. He learned how long things actually took when no one fast-tracked them on his behalf. It was disorienting and strangely clarifying. The media tried a few angles. Reckless Omega Heir undermines stability. Romantic impulse threatens billion-dollar operations. They never named Rook. That omission was deliberate. Erasure was safer than confrontation. Ision read every article anyway, sitting on the edge of a borrowed couch in the modest apartment he'd moved into near the shop. The place smelled like old wood and laundry detergent. The windows rattled when trucks passed. It felt real. Rook came home late most nights, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, clothes stained with honest work. The shop reopened slowly. Repairs first, upgrades later. Insurance dragged its feet. Replacements took time. "Maybe I should have let you walk away," Ision said one night, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Rook paused, one hand on the sink, water running. He turned it off and faced him fully. "Don't do that," Rook said quietly. "I put a target on you," Ision said. "On your work, your life." Rook shook his head. "They put the target there. You just stopped pretending it wasn't loaded." Ision swallowed. "I could have chosen stability," he said. "Everything would have been easier." Rook stepped closer. "For who?" The question echoed painfully. The board released a statement the following week. Measured, disappointed, unmistakably distancing. They affirmed confidence in the company's long-term vision while expressing concern about individual decision-making. Iseon smiled when he read it. Individual decision-making. That was what they called autonomy when it made them uncomfortable. The true cost came not in money or status, but in severed narratives. Friends from his old life didn't call, not out of cruelty, but uncertainty. He no longer fit the story they'd built around him. He was no longer the Omega heir who would eventually be placed somewhere safe and powerful. He was something worse, unpredictable. One afternoon, while helping Rook clean soot from a salvaged tool cabinet, Aishin paused, hands shaking slightly as fatigue caught up with him. "I don't regret it," he said suddenly. "I just didn't realize how much of my life had been borrowed." Rook glanced at him. "Borrowed how?" "By expectations," Ision said. "By people who told me who I was before I ever tried to find out." Rook handed him a rag. "Then this is yours now." Iseon took it. The threats didn't come back. Not openly. They didn't need to. The elite punished by exclusion, by withholding access, by ensuring you were no longer invited into the rooms where outcomes were decided. It was a slow pressure meant to make people crawl back. Iseon didn't. He learned the shop's rhythm instead. The logic of labor finished, of problems solved visibly. He learned the satisfaction of work that didn't need applause. He learned how it felt to choose a life and then live it. One night, lying awake beside Rook, the city humming faintly outside, Iseon whispered the question that still haunted him. "Do you ever wish I'd chosen differently?" Rook didn't answer immediately. Then, "No," he said, "because if you had, you wouldn't be here. You'd be somewhere impressive and empty." Iseon closed his eyes, breath steadying. They had offered him power, status, everything, and taken away the illusion that those things were free. Was the cost worth it? Iseon thought of the boardroom, the shop fire, the silence. The weight lifted from his chest when he finally stood up and spoke. He knew his answer, and if the world thought he'd chosen wrong, why did it feel like the first right decision of his life? If you were in his place, would you have chosen comfort, or the person who sees you when nothing else does? At what point does everything become too expensive to accept? Life did not simplify. It clarified. That was the difference Iseon hadn't expected. The days near the shop settled into a rhythm that ignored his last name completely. Morning meant the grind of the bay door rolling up, the smell of oil and metal warming under work lights, the low music Rook favored because it didn't get in the way of listening to engines. Afternoon meant deliveries, customers, arguments over parts that didn't fit the way the catalog promised they would. Nothing bowed to him, and somehow that felt like relief. Iseon learned how long things actually took, how patience wasn't a virtue when people preached it, but a skill you practiced when there was no alternative. He learned how to wait without assuming someone would make the waiting shorter for him. The first time he took transit alone after the board fallout, he stood gripping a pole while the train lurched forward and thought, absurdly, so this is it. Not humiliation, not freedom, just movement, shared with strangers who didn't know him and didn't need to. Status, it turned out, had been doing most of the shouting in his old life. Without it, the world was quieter. Rook never treated him like a project. That mattered more than any reassurance could. When Iseon offered to cover a delayed shipment out of pocket, Rook shook his head. We'll solve it the right way. When Iseon suggested hiring extra help to speed repairs, Rook asked, do you want speed or do you want it done well? The question cut straight through the reflex to throw resources at discomfort. I want it done right, Iseon said. Rook nodded. Then we wait. The legal protections came next. Not dramatic, not punitive. Transparent filings, public compliance, lawyers who worked daylight hours and put everything in writing. The kind of protection that didn't cage, didn't hide, didn't dare anyone to push back in the dark. Funny how pressure faded when it couldn't hide behind shadows. The audit stopped. The zoning complaint evaporated. Insurance finally moved. The shop reopened fully, scars still visible if you knew where to look, but stronger for having been forced to rebuild honestly. People noticed, not the elites. Those circles remained closed, cool, uninterested. But customers noticed, neighbors noticed. People who valued work finished and promises kept. So did the press eventually. A business reporter called, curious about the Heir slumming it. Iseon declined the phrasing, accepted the interview, and corrected the premise calmly. He spoke about governance, about consent, about what happens when power assumes it owns the people attached to it. The article was measured, unflattering to the board, human to him. Rook read it over coffee the next morning and snorted. They finally learned how to spell your name right. Iseon laughed. Quiet, real. At night, in the small apartment with the rattling windows, Iseon slept better than he ever had in rooms designed to impress. He woke without the familiar dread of being managed that day. He made breakfast. He burned toast. He learned. One evening, after a long shift, they sat on the shop's steps, watching the light fade. I don't miss it, Iseon said, surprising himself. Rook glanced over. Miss what? Being important, Iseon replied, at least the way they defined it. Rook considered. You're still important. Iseon shook his head. Not like that. Good, Rook said simply. The word landed softly and solid. Status had been loud. It demanded attention, obedience, proof. It measured worth in proximity to power and punished anyone who stepped out of line. This life didn't ask to be impressed. It asked to be lived. Iseon felt lighter not because he had less, but because he no longer carried expectations that weren't his. He hadn't abandoned responsibility. He'd redefined it. Responsibility now meant transparency, consent, standing where he chose and letting the consequences be real. When he looked at Rook, grease-stained, tired, steady, he didn't see safety as a cage or love as a liability. He saw partnership. Status stopped mattering the moment it stopped deciding for him. And in the quiet left behind, Iseon realized something that would have terrified his advisors. He was free enough to stay. Choosing Rook had been the loud decision. Choosing himself was quieter. It happened in small, almost unremarkable moments, when Iseon stopped flinching at unfamiliar numbers on bills, when he corrected a supplier without apologizing first, when he let a meeting run long because the work mattered more than optics. No one applauded these choices. No one needed to. The person who noticed most was Rook, not because he hovered, but because he paid attention. Iseon had expected resentment, some echo of imbalance, a tension between what he'd been and what he was becoming. Instead, Rook insisted on something Iseon wasn't used to, equality that didn't perform. No, Rook said once, when Iseon tried to defer on a decision about expanding the shop's hours. We decide together, not because of your past, because you're here. Being here was the skill Iseon was still learning. He returned to the company not as a figurehead, not as a benevolent shadow pulling strings from afar, but as an operator who asked difficult questions and accepted inconvenient answers. He separated ownership from intimacy, kept governance public, documented, clean. The board disliked the transparency. Regulators didn't. Power changed shape when it stopped hiding. Some days were harder than others. The old instincts surfaced, control as comfort, distance as safety. When they did, Ision named them out loud. "I'm doing the thing," he'd say. Rook would nod. "Then stop." And Ision would. That was the partnership. No leverage, no debt, no unspoken fear masquerading as care. They talked about the future without turning it into a contract, about buying the building if the numbers worked, about apprentices, about what it meant to grow something without asking permission from people who believed they owned him. "You don't have to prove anything," Rook said one night, as they sorted receipts at the kitchen table. "I know," Asyan replied. "I want to." That difference mattered. Asyan began to understand that being an Omega heir had never been the problem. The problem had been letting others define what that meant, letting them equate softness with compliance, care with containment. He refused that equation now. He kept the parts that were his: patience, observation, the ability to see how systems pressed on people who couldn't afford to push back. He discarded the rest. When an old advisor reached out, tentative, testing, Ision answered politely and declined the meeting. When a journalist asked if he regretted burning bridges, Ision corrected the premise. "I didn't burn them," he said. "I walked away." The piece ran anyway. It didn't change much. It didn't need to. What changed was internal. Aishan stood differently, spoke without scanning faces for approval, loved without bargaining. One afternoon, Rook handed him a set of keys, plain, unmarked. "For what?" Iseon asked. Rook shrugged. "The shop, if I'm late." Iseon closed his fingers around them and felt something settle into place. Not ownership. Trust. He chose himself again that day, not as an act of defiance, but as a habit. That was the real inheritance he claimed, a life that didn't require him to sell his future to feel secure, a love that didn't demand he shrink to be safe. He had power still, he used it carefully, he had status still. It followed, quieter now. What he kept was better. The elite moved on. They always did. New Omega heirs were presented. New alliances floated through the same boardrooms where Ision's name was now spoken with a careful neutrality. Neither praise nor warning, just an example quietly filed away. A deviation, an anomaly, a lesson best not examined too closely. The Heir Empire continued without spectacle. Profits stabilized. Governance adapted. The machine proved what Ision had always suspected. It had never needed him to be obedient. It had needed him to be useful. And when he stopped being that kind of useful, it simply adjusted. Ision didn't watch from a distance anymore. He stayed involved, deliberately and visibly, but without drama. He signed documents at a scratched wooden table instead of a glass one. He took meetings in daylight and ended them when they stopped being honest. He insisted on minutes, on records, on accountability that didn't depend on whispered favors. Some people respected that. Others resented it. Neither reaction ruled his life. What ruled it was smaller and steadier. Morning light spilling into the apartment while Rook made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The shop opening on time, the satisfaction of a job finished, and a customer driving away without being impressed by anything except the work. No one bowed to him here, no one asked him to perform gratitude for access. He was just a man who showed up. One afternoon, months after the fire, Iseon stood at the edge of the bay and watched Rook teach an apprentice how to listen to an engine instead of forcing it. Patient, exact, unshowy. "This part," Rook said, tapping the metal lightly, "tells you when to stop." Iseon smiled to himself. The lesson applied everywhere. That night, sitting together on the apartment floor with takeout containers and paperwork spread around them, Iseon felt the weight of his old life finally loosen completely. Not bitterness, not triumph, acceptance. "They offered me everything," he said quietly. Rook glanced at him. "Everything according to who?" Iseon considered. "According to people who thought power was a place you stood instead of something you chose how to use." Rook nodded. "And what did you keep?" Iseon didn't answer right away. He thought of the boardroom certainty, the velvet threats, The silence meant to teach him regret. He thought of the shop fire, the nights of doubt, the fear that choosing love meant choosing loss. Then he looked around, at grease under his nails, at shared decisions, at a future that didn't need permission to exist. I kept myself, Ision said finally, and I kept you. Rook reached over, squeezed his hand once, no spectacle, no claim, just presence. The world outside still valued status. It still rewarded obedience, dressed up as stability. Nothing about that had changed. What changed was that Ision no longer measured his worth against it. They had offered him power, status, everything. He chose the man who fixed what mattered. He chose a life that didn't require leverage to feel secure. He chose love not as a rebellion, but as a decision made every day, without debt. And in the quiet that followed that choice, Ision understood something the board never would. Love isn't a downgrade. It's the only thing that doesn't ask you to disappear in order to keep it.